so I went and got it. They talk down on my city, but my city matter. Please pray for my city. Too much hate in my city. Too many heartaches in my city, but I got faith in my city. This Chirac and I love that. You can't take it away from my city. Some can't relate to my city. They die every day in my city, yeah.
Welcome to another edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Thursday, July the 16th, 2020. What you just heard there was an excerpt from Pray for My City by Nick Cannon, a lyric that he sang back in 2015, and it was in the film Chirac, Spike Lee's film about gun violence in Chicago from that year, 2015. In fact, it was from the opening credits of that film. It's already, as I said, it's on the soundtrack for the film as well. But it is not Chirac or Chicago that I'm going to be speaking about today. Although certainly I hope in the next few days, if not the next coming weeks, there will be an episode that I'm going to be doing that gets into the issues of violence and what is happening in this summer, which has been going on now for so many years. We need to talk about that as well and get behind the root causes of that and get to those. Today's episode is going to be about not necessarily Nick Cannon, but about something that I have seen and noticed now a lot within a segment of the black community, particularly from some black men, and prominent black men particularly. More about anti-Semitism, the growing, it seems, in some segments of the black community, specifically among some black men in prominent places. Anti-Semitism, and I would also add to that, the misogynoir and misogynization in some of the black men who, again, are in high places, prominent places, famous black men. I want to get into a bit of that today. Let's talk about that next. Welcome back. I just did an episode about this last week. Anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as I mentioned last week, is getting worse in this country. The hatred targeted at Jewish people is on the rise in this country. In 2018, the FBI statistics on hate crimes found that while there was a very slight decrease in hate crime overall, the number of hate crimes based on religious origin had gone up, and had gone up most when it came to attacks on Jewish people. 58% of those attacks, religious hatred and bigotry, 58% of those attacks were against Jewish people in 2018. In 2019, according to the Anti-Defamation League, American Jews were targets of more anti-Semitic incidents than any other year over the past 40 years. This is coming from The Religion News Service, dated May the 12th, 2020, Michael Kunzelman, reporting on this. And I'm reading now from his article. And the article is entitled, Report, Anti-Semitic Incidents in U.S. Hit Record High in 2019. The Jewish Civil Rights Group, and that is the ADL, Anti-Defamation League, counted 2,107 anti-Semitic incidents in 2019, finding 61 physical assault cases, 1,127 instances of harassment, and 919 acts of vandalism. That's the highest annual tally since the New York City-based group began tracking anti-Semitic incidents in 1979. It also marked a 12% increase over the 1,879 incidents it counted in 2018. Jonathan Greenblatt, the group's CEO, attributes last year's record high to, quote, a normalization of anti-Semitic tropes, the charged politics of the day, and social media. This year, he said, the COVID-19 pandemic is fueling anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Quote, anti-Semitism is a virus. It's like a disease, and it persists, Greenblatt said. It's sometimes known as the oldest hatred. It never seems to go away. There truly is no single antidote or cure. This report goes on to talk about objects thrown at victims, anti-Semitic slurs. At least 3 victims were punched or hit in their heads or faces. A lot of this happened, according to the report, in New York City, 25 of the assaults in Brooklyn specifically. There was a guy, Grafton Thomas, 37 years old, charged with stabbing 5 people with a machete at a Hanukkah celebration at a rabbi's home in Monsey, an Orthodox Jewish community north of New York City. One of the 5 victims, died 3 months after the December 28th attack. That is December 28th of last year. Federal prosecutors said Thomas had handwritten journals containing anti-Semitic comments and a swastika. That is just some of the background that I want to lay down here. There has been a complicated relationship between black people and Jewish people throughout the history of the United States. There's no question about it. There has also been a long-standing history of brotherhood and sisterhood in the black and Jewish communities between the two groups. There were black people and Jewish people who together founded the NAACP in the early 1900s. And at the time, if I'm not mistaken, the organization was headed by someone who was a member of the Jewish community and really had promoted a brotherhood amongst black people, Jewish people, in fighting against racism. Some of the allies that the black communities throughout the United States can certainly count on are members of the Jewish community who for many decades have stood with, alongside, and actively been part of the human rights, civil rights movement throughout the United States. There's just no question about that. The strongest allies that black people have had from the white community in this country have been people of Jewish faith. So while there have been certainly complicated relationships in the past, and still today, I think, in some degree, and that has to be looked at, can't deny those things. We must also make it very clear, and make it very, very clear, in fact, that there has and still continues to be a strong affinity. The sense of struggle, the sense of history, oppression, there is a kinship amongst black people and amongst Jewish people that I think remains strong. And as I say, there's always going to be, and there have been, of course, areas where that has not happened. And there's always going to be some aspects of the communities where that has not been the case. As I said last week in the episode that I did on anti-Semitism, there are always, again, going to be some individuals in any community who say or do things that are harmful to the black community or the Jewish community or any community. There's always going to be small groups of people. It's never a whole group. And that's where my problem is. When people generalize about black people or any group of people, but particularly black people, in this case, oppressed classes getting generalized. When I say something like the following, if I say that white people have privilege in this country and benefit from a system of racism and white dominance, that is not anything that can be construed as anything other than what it is, which is the truth. There's no question about that. But if I say to you something about a particular religious faith and say that that faith and the people who are part of that faith are wholesale doing things as a faith to harm the black community, that is anti-Semitic. There's no question about that. If I'm talking about Jewish people particularly, then that is a statement that is anti-Semitic. You are now attacking a specific faith and saying things about that faith that are injurious, hateful. You are targeting a particular group of people. There's no question that that would be an anti-Semitic statement. And I would hope that people who are listening to this would agree with that. I mean, that should not be up for any kind of debate. I mean, when the mayor of New York City, a couple of months ago, made a blanket statement in a tweet about the Jewish community shouldn't be out here. When I told you all, I'm paraphrasing here, when I told you all that you're supposed to be inside, why are you out at this funeral? And instead of him tweeting something specific to a certain part of a community, there were members of the Hasidic community or the Orthodox community here in Brooklyn who violated my order here, and therefore we had to close your funeral down. If he had tweeted something more specific like that, where he is talking about a segment of a community, rather than tweet out the Jewish community at large, there would have been far, far less rancor and upset. Bill de Blasio, I think, has fallen on his backside, for lack of a better word. I don't think he's done a very good job as New York mayor, but that's a whole nother conversation. My point of bringing up Mayor de Blasio in New York City is that he himself has tweeted out a statement. This is just a few months ago now, when there was a funeral in a community in Brooklyn amongst some of the Orthodox community, and there were, I think, a few hundred people from the Orthodox community and unorthodox community that had been out in the street in violation of an order in terms of gathering during this pandemic that we are still going through. And that tweet that I talked about was what de Blasio said, and he got a lot of heat for that, and understandably so, because of the way it was worded. The Washington Times, January the 8th, 2020, written by Jessica Chasmar, Chasmar. Headline: James Harris, New Jersey NAACP official, suspended over comments on Jews. James Harris is an African-American man. The New Jersey NAACP suspended him this year over comments he made about Jewish people that were deemed anti-Semitic. During a December 30th community meeting, James Harris, the Montclair NAACP's Education Committee chair, accused the local Jewish community of gentrifying the area and hurting Black and Latino families. I mean, this is what he said. I'm really reluctant to even repeat these things. But I just want to illustrate to you, this is what's being said and how it's being said. The Jewish community, this is a quote from James Harris, December the 30th, 2019. Quote, "The Jewish community controls the Board of Education and the City Council, but they spent huge amounts of money sending kids to the yeshivas," he said during the meeting. Quote, "And they've gutted the budget for the Black and Latino students who are left in the public schools," end quote. That is a highly irresponsible statement. And not only that, it's anti-Semitic. The Jewish community? Do you hear the generalization there? Do you hear the targeting? He didn't identify one or two or three people. He said a whole community. Do you understand and see where the issue is? Do you understand and see how that is anti-Semitic? This is the thing that I think people have to be educated on. And I'm going to turn now to other members of the Black community. Now look, there's no generalization here. In my estimation, this is not a question. The vast majority of people in the Black community, I imagine, I believe, no, I do not speak for everybody in the Black community, But I do believe that most black people are not like this. I think that particularly amongst some black men, and clearly high-profile black men, there is a lot of ignorance. Some of the individuals that we are hearing about, whether they are political leaders, whether they are members of the NAACP, can somebody tell James Harris that you had a president of the NAACP for the first few years who was Jewish, who did some really great things to contribute to the founding of the organization? Can someone say that there were black people and Jewish people who did that? Can someone tell James Harris to read the book Simple Justice? I believe the author was Richard Kluger, Kluger. Can someone educate that brother and tell him? And for that matter, can someone educate Louis Farrakhan? Now, Farrakhan has done some good things in the black community, but he has also said things that I would say are definitely anti-Semitic. There's just no question about it. You're calling Judaism a gutter religion? I have a problem with that. Are there people who stand up and speak up for the liberation of black people? Yes, Farrakhan's one of them. Farrakhan's also the same Farrakhan, of course, in the Nation of Islam, who had a lot to do with in my view, the assassination of Malcolm X. Farrakhan is also somebody who, while he has spoken up about black people's plights, continues to say things against Jewish people that I think are hateful. I just don't, that's my personal view. I don't think there's a question about that. Malcolm X himself, when he was on his pilgrimage and coming back from his pilgrimage, his Hajj from Mecca, apologized about all the things he had said about white people, and including Jewish people in that, because he said things about Jewish people too that were hateful. He acknowledged all of that. If Malcolm X could apologize, if Jesse Jackson could apologize, why can't Farrakhan? If Nick Cannon, whom you heard to begin this episode, could apologize, and he now is, and I'm going to read some of the tweets that he has put out. Nick Cannon, for those of you who don't know, is an actor, entertainer, someone who sings as well. I don't know if I'd call him a rapper per se, but he sings, he's recorded albums, or he's certainly been in the music business, I'll say that. To a degree, he's been in the music business, and he's got a lot of different ventures that he does, and he's on television. He was once married to Mariah Carey. But if Nick Cannon, who had a podcast, he still does, and he invited Richard Griffin on, Professor Griff, the former member of Public Enemy, and they kicked him out of that group, or he left that group, over things, I think, connected to this. If Nick Cannon can apologize, and again, I'll get to some of what he had to say on Twitter in a few minutes, then why can't people like Farrakhan do that? Does anybody who makes these kinds of statements understand and study 1964? Do they study the 3 civil rights workers? James Chaney, a black man from the South, and 2 white Northerners, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, both of whom were also Jewish. Those 2 men died alongside James Chaney when all 3 of them were murdered by the Klan on June the 21st, 1964 in Mississippi. And all that the 3 men were doing was registering black people to vote. I wonder if any of the people I've talked about understand that and know that history. And I wonder if any of that would make a difference to them. I wonder if they understood the long tradition of black and Jewish cooperation, as well as the times where that has not happened, and as well as the times where members of that community, where there have been some individuals in the Jewish community who haven't always seen eye to eye with some members of the black community and vice versa. And there have been some historical things that have happened in segments of those communities that have not helped. And as I said, all of this has to be looked at, because history is history. And there are bad actors in history. But to call a whole group of people, the entire group of the whole of the Jewish community, that's reprehensible. And it's so interesting, all of the Jacksons, it's just, you can't script this. Jesse Jackson, Michael Jackson. Remember his song back in the year 1995? Great song, except for the word, well, I'm not going to repeat the words, but there were words in that song. They don't care about us. And there were some anti-Semitic references in there. There was a anti-Jewish slur being used in that song. And Michael Jackson apologized, and he had it removed from the next pressing of his History album. I actually still have the original pressing of that album from 1995. So that song, when it's played, that part is still in there. And you know which part that is if you are an avid Michael Jackson fan and know that song. If you get the pressing today, you will not hear the hateful words spoken. And in the video for that song, you won't hear them either. But it's interesting about the Jacksons. I don't know why this is. I don't know what that means. But it is interesting that a number of people, black men, with the last name Jackson, which of course is not our real name, if you think about it, given the enslavement we were taken from the African continent. But it's so interesting to me that Jesse Jackson, Michael Jackson, DeSean Jackson, Steven Jackson, and O'Shea Jackson, otherwise known as Ice Cube, have all either said or supported anti-Jewish statements or anti-Semitic statements. By the way, that is a form of racism, anti-Semitism. Do you know that that is a form of racism? That is racist. That is racist. I mean, people don't link that, but that anti-Semitic Anti-Semitism is racism. You are calling on a group, a race, a faith of people, and you are saying these racist things about them. Let's put that out there too. Some of the irresponsible language that is coming from people. The good thing here is that DeSean Jackson is getting himself educated. He has spoken to a number of people, including a survivor of the Holocaust against Jewish people that occurred within the last 85 years. I mean, this is DeSean Jackson said some unforgivable things, quite frankly. One of the things that he is doing now, though, is learning, growing, speaking to people, educating himself, speaking to Jewish activists and leaders and people in the Jewish community, some of whom, as I said, are Holocaust survivors. I mean, he's doing work. He's meeting with people. He's having a dialogue with people. He is listening. That is maturity and growth. That is someone who really does want to open his heart and understand and open his mind. Stephen Jackson, I'm not so sure about. Stephen Jackson, of course, was a very good friend to George Floyd. And when he was on Don Lemon's show last week, as I talked about last week, he was very defensive. It sounded very agitated. But there's a lot of ignorance talking. And I think he has since apologized as well. But there's work to be done. And by the way, for some people in the media to start saying, oh, the Black Lives Matter movement has been compromised now because of one person or two people saying some anti-Jewish things. Well, come on now. The whole movement is not compromised. These two people are compromised. And quite frankly, people who do not speak up against anti-Semitism are compromised. But to now say that the Black Lives Matter movement itself is compromised because of one Jackson? I could have said it Jack something else. But because of what one or two Jacksons say? No, the whole movement's not compromised. We must stand up and condemn anti-Semitism. That's the answer to that. Because not only should we just stand up and condemn it, we have to actively fight it. We must. If you hear people saying things about Jewish people that are hateful, you have a responsibility to speak up against it right there when it happens and condemn it. That's action. That is taking a stand and making it clear that that is not welcome where you are or anywhere else in the space that you are in. And it should be condemned. Must be condemned. I said last week that we must stand up against anti-Semitism. I said last week that one of the greatest, among others, greatest measures of respect I have for people in the Jewish community is when they stand up and say never again, because they want the world to know, and quite rightly, that this cannot stand, that we are not going back to the era where so many Jewish people were genocided. We are not going back there. Now, perhaps some of the Jewish community who may be listening to this may certainly say that we are heading back, because these incidents show, quite frankly, these anti-Semitic incidents certainly show that we are backsliding. Donald Trump the chief architect. But this was happening long before Donald Trump. Although people forget that in 2017, do you remember that there were vandalizations of Jewish cemeteries along in the Midwest, particularly in Kansas and other places, and a number of other places around the country? There were vandalizing of Jewish cemeteries. People have forgotten that already. 2017, while Donald Trump was in office, his first year in office. I don't even remember if the FBI sufficiently investigated that. Donald Trump said not a word about it. I believe in the state of Minnesota there were a number of vandalizations of Jewish cemeteries. Trump said nothing. I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about all of this. I'm concerned that in some segments of the black community, particularly black men, specifically black men, and again, it's a small group. I'm talking about these prominent black men, like Ice Cube, who yesterday had the nerve to attack Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Because Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, of course, the legendary NBA Hall of Famer, Los Angeles Laker, activist, philanthropist, humanitarian, journalist, wrote about the growing, rising levels of anti-Semitism in this country and talked about the need to fight back and speak up against it. He asked, I think, a very pertinent question, which was, where is the outrage over anti-Semitism in sports and Hollywood? I don't think that there's anything wrong with that question. This is actually written in the Hollywood Reporter, July the 14th, 2020, by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The Hollywood Reporter columnist calls out the hateful outbursts against Jews by Ice Cube, DeSean Jackson, and others, and explains how the muted response, quote, perpetuates racism, end quote, and contributes to an overall apathy, basically what is being said there. I think this is just really disgusting that Ice Cube, O'Shea Jackson in real life, is standing up here defending this stuff and attacking Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I just think this is so irresponsible. And the problem is you have these kinds of black men being promoted. Now, granted, they are rappers, they may be high-profile people. But really, I think that, and I've said this before, black male ignorance has been promoted in this country. And the people who are black and male, who speak with some kind of credibility and smarts, are not getting the visibility in the news media or in the corporate news media that some of these lesser enlightened individuals, shall we say, are getting. You've got ignorance. Ben Carson, ignorant. Now, all I know about Carson is he, to my knowledge, has never said anything anti-Jewish. What I'm talking about is, in general, there's this ignorance that's being promoted, and particularly targeting black men. And this also is something that I'm concerned about for this election coming up. Kanye West, who now, right on cue, this week, has dropped out of the presidential race that he was never really running for in the first place. It was all a publicity stunt, as I said to you in an episode I did recently on Kanye West. It was just a bunch of nonsense. Publicity stunt to get some records sold, an album sold. Didn't file a single piece of paper. The deadlines for many of these states to be an independent candidate had already passed weeks and months ago. But this is a real problem. I mean, in the article that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote, he even mentions Chelsea Handler. Chelsea Handler is Jewish herself. Posting videos of Farrakhan Donald Trump is definitely an anti-Semite. And I don't care that he has a son-in-law who is Jewish. That is the least of it. This guy has sent out anti-Semitic things throughout his life. He said anti-Semitic things that deal with money. All of these anti-Jewish tropes that get thrown out there, even still today, this stuff has not stopped. This is what we have to really fight against, people. We really do. This is not a joke. And some of the ignorance out there and the hatred. You've got Ice Cube. This is a guy that's got a platform. And with your platform, you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to open your mouth and say things that uplift people. Say the truth in terms of what we're facing in this world and what we've got to do. That you have a special responsibility. When you speak, just like the idiot in the White House has a responsibility which he doesn't abide to. That when he speaks, he has to take care that his messaging and his demeanor are upright and not in the gutter of hatred. He has failed. And again, there's a cross segment of men in the black community. And again, it's a small group of people who are prominent in that community, who are on television, who are making music, who are leaders, who say these very dangerous, very toxic things about Jewish people and, quite frankly, also about black women. That's something that we cannot have. We have this in the community as well. We've got people in the hip-hop community, in the philanthropy community, who get all this publicity, Russell Simmons, and clearly talk about and have done things to black women that are unspeakable. Sexual assault, rape. There's documentaries about this. They're not getting the kind of prominence, or maybe not in the prominent places. There are courageous people like C.L.I. Abrams. C.L.I. Abrams is a black woman who had been attacked by violently attacked by members of the hip-hop community. One or two of these individuals. Russell Simmons. She's talked about this. And then you've got some of these black men who are also in prominent circles who prop these guys up, prop them up. I mean, I used to follow on Twitter, and I forget his name now. I think his first name is Mark. He used to be on CNN, and he made a speech about, and he said something about Jewish people, or said something about Israel. Now, as I've said before, there are people and policies in that government that have absolutely been damaging and desecrating to the Palestinians. I am never going to say otherwise. The policies of the Israeli government have led to the wholesale bloodshed of many Palestinians. Now, I'm talking about the policies of a government. There is a difference between talking about the policies of a government and talking about a group of specific people, or talking about a whole race of people, I should say. There's a difference. Because what I'm talking about is government policy. I'm not talking about a whole race of people, a whole faith of people. Big difference. Some people would argue me down and say, oh no, that's anti-Semitic. I would respectfully differ. When you're talking about things that a government does, you're talking about that government. You're not identifying a whole race of people. But if people don't agree with me, they don't agree with that. But identifying a fact that policies of a government have led to the murders of a group of people, that is not anything that is other than historical. That's a fact. That's history. That's the present. And there's so many people in the Jewish community who, by the way, in fact, in Israel, who stand up against this too. They don't get the publicity here in the United States. Do you know that there's so many Israelis who are against what the Israeli government is doing? Are they anti-Semitic? If you have an objection to the policies of a government, you are anti that government. You are anti their policies. Specifically, you're not anti their faith. You're not attacking their faith. You're attacking their policies that lead to the deaths of Palestinians. There are many people in Israel who are Jewish, who are absolutely against what's happening to the Palestinians. Absolutely against the Israeli government, Netanyahu. Now there's this power sharing going on. Netanyahu's taking the first 18 months or so, and then Benny Gantz from the Blue and White Party taking on the second 18 months or so, whatever, of their power sharing agreement. And let me tell you, their policies aren't all that different from each other. And there are many Jewish people in Israel who are against what the Israeli government's doing. So and there are many Jewish people in this country, I suspect as well, who are against what is happening to the Palestinians. I've seen some of the activists out here who make no mistake that they are very much against what's going on. Of course, the corporate news media here completely ignores it. They never talk to people who are against this. They make it seem as if everybody is pro the violence against Palestinians. And then they will interview one or two people who are supporting it and never talk to anybody else. Almost never. But I risk going off on a tangent here. I want to get back to some of this stuff. We have to start cleaning house here. And when I say cleaning house, I mean we need to have conversations in the black community, in aspects and certain segments of the black community. And particularly, again, and I'm sure this applies to some people who are not famous, but a segment of black men in the high profile community who are behaving in very destructive ways towards black women. I mean, this goes on beyond the high profile group, because domestic violence against black women has skyrocketed. And I need to do, and I will be doing at some point, an episode on domestic violence and getting into some of that too, particularly as it concerns black women. This has got to stop now, folks. I'm not having it. I'm totally not having this. We've got to be better than this. What I am heartened by is that some of the people who have said these disgusting and reprehensible things about Jewish people, some of them are turning to get help. And I think that's a good first step. Be it DeSean Jackson, be it Nick Cannon. And quite frankly, I wish that the media would spotlight that more. Because while it is important to let everybody know that these repugnant and reprehensible things are being said, I think it is equally important as well to show people that DeSean Jackson and Nick Cannon are going about the process of educating themselves and speaking to Jewish community leaders and people in more prominent places like the ADL and the Simon Wiesenthal Center. I think it's very important to spotlight that. And that should be part of what we're seeing on television as well. So often the racist thing, will get said, but then you won't see the follow-up. I think that's necessary to show us, though. I think it's necessary to show that. But I think it is very important that people who do these things show that they're doing work, do the work. And it doesn't have to be for the cameras. I get that. I understand that. At the same time, yeah, maybe I'm arguing against myself here. That it doesn't have to be a photo op. But I do think awareness needs to be shown. I'm going to come back in a moment and talk about, or at least read out, the tweets from Nick Cannon over the last 24 hours or so. I'll be right back. Welcome back. And, I hear people say, well, we don't care about Nick Cannon. I've heard some black people say that. I've heard members of the black press write things. I've seen the things they've written, or one of them, in The Root, about thank you, Nick Cannon. There's nothing to thank Nick Cannon for. It's like when people say, well, thank you. We're glad that the good thing that comes out of Donald Trump doing this is that he shows everybody that we still got lots of work to do. Are you kidding? We already knew that we had lots of work to do in this country when it comes to ending white dominance and ending whiteness and the racism against black people, anti-blackness. We knew that before Donald Trump walked into the White House. Oh, the good thing that comes out of this is that he's showing us he's taken off the covers. Come on. Same thing with what people say about this pandemic. Oh, the pandemic has shown us. What has it shown us? That we are still the same as we always were in this country. We still got a whole lot of selfish, racist people in this country who are soulless as well. I mean, it didn't take us COVID-19 to figure out that the oppression against black and brown people continues. It only magnifies it's part of the systemic issue. The system is what magnifies this, because the system is this. We fall for these curations of language. And language, I keep saying this, is so important. How we speak about these things, the context in which we speak. We're all learning. We're all struggling with the language, some of us. There's no manual for this, but the best manual is education. None of us are works of perfection. Quite frankly, we wouldn't be here if we were. But we have to stop using these ridiculous buzzwords and these turns of phrase. Well, the pandemic ripped the covers off of this, or Donald Trump ripped off the covers of race. Give me a break. That's just a bunch of nonsense. And the same thing that I saw in The Root. And I support the black press. I think the black press is vitally important to this country and the world. And The Root, the Griot, other black newspapers all across this country are doing priceless work. There are people like Joe Madison, people like Laura Coates, people like Roland Martin, his daily show, Roland Martin Unfiltered, Joe Madison, the Black Eagle on Sirius XM, Laura Coates on Sirius XM in the Urban View. Vitally important. Karen Hunter does great work as well on the Urban View, as does Joe Madison. Sirius XM, both of them, all of those individuals. Except Roland Martin, he's on iHeartRadio these days now. And very important people. And there are lots of others, and I'm sorry I've not mentioned them all. But The Root, and a writer there, his headline or whoever wrote that, thank you, Nick Cannon. No, there's nothing to thank Nick Cannon for. I should remind people, Nick Cannon was the guy who wore a turban. And I mean, my goodness me. I mean, you should kind of know about Nick Cannon right there, shouldn't you? There's a lot of ignorance and hatred and just buffoonery, quite frankly, that goes on. And when you're rich, when you are prominent, you think you're untouchable. You think you're untouchable. You really think that you are untouchable. It's just like people who are younger, and young people in general, not all of them, but, many of them think they're invincible. So you have a platform. You have your music career. You have your television career. What was it? America's Got Talent? That was something that Nick Cannon used to be on, if he's not already still on it. I don't think he is anymore. It's not the first time that Nick Cannon's made the news. I'm not saying that Nick Cannon is a terrible human being. Maybe Mariah Carey can tell us if that's true or not. None of our business, quite frankly. But I do know that he has to grow up. Quite frankly, doesn't he have children? I mean, there are lots of people who have kids who are still children themselves. And I'm not talking about them being 21 or 19. I'm talking about in their minds. Look at the guy in the White House. Who's a bigger child than he is? Who's a bigger psychopath than he is in this country? Who's a bigger sociopath than him? And he's still a 74-year-old child. People have some growing up to do. We all have things to learn and evolve and grow in. We all have to be better. And people who have these large platforms, who have millions of Twitter followers and Instagram and Facebook followers and all of that, who have people who, all these likes on their Facebook pages, and have a large following, a huge following, global following, have a special responsibility. We all have to be responsible. Wear your mask, everybody. We all have to have levels of responsibility. We all have to be responsible for our actions. I know you have a guy in the White House who's not responsible for anything. And the people, the 30% of those in this country, or 35 max, who continue to follow him off the Grand Canyon, also are not exercising any responsibility for themselves, for their children, for anything. It's the laziest society of people, these 35%, that you can ever imagine. And they define freedom as not having to do a thing, not having to lift a finger, not having to sacrifice. Wearing a mask isn't even really a sacrifice. It's an act of kindness and respect for yourself, for people around you. And they've abdicated even that element of their own humanity. That's how bad this gets. That's how problematic this is. I'm not going to thank Nick Cannon. I'm definitely not going to thank Donald Trump. I don't thank these people. Oh, you've exposed something. I mean, this is ignorance and hatred. I'm not thanking them. Ignorance and hatred have pre-existed both Nick Cannon and Donald Trump, and DeSean Jackson and Stephen Jackson and Chelsea Handler. And yes, there have been these white entertainers too who've used blackface. I think Chelsea Handler had done that at one point, or had said some racist things. I mean, she's Jewish. As I said earlier, she apologized for these things. She had a tour that she'd gone on where she said these racist things about people on the African continent. I'm not thanking Chelsea Handler or Sarah Silverman or anybody else when they say these either racist or, these offensive things. Everybody has responsibility. Everybody does. And no, because one or two black people say something that is anti-Jewish, they're destroying the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't think so. They're destroying themselves. And we have to speak up against that and speak up against what they say that is injurious to any community, including against black women, as I said. Because, again, and I want to get into this in another episode more in depth, because this is a huge problem. And some of these guys with the music have endorsed this kind of thing forever. This violence against women. As promised, I'm going to read out some of Nick Cannon's tweets. This is over the last, as I record this, the last 12 hours or so. First and foremost, this is from Nick Cannon, at Nick Cannon. And by the way, I've retweeted these on my Twitter page the popcorn, REEL. So here is what Nick Cannon tweeted on Wednesday, July the 15th. First and foremost, I extend my deepest and most sincere apologies to my Jewish sisters and brothers for the hurtful and divisive words that came out of my mouth during my interview with Richard Griffin. That's Professor Griff, formerly a Public Enemy. And he, too, I mean, just ridiculous, to say the least. It's the least of it with him. Nick Cannon continues, they reinforced the worst stereotypes of a proud and magnificent people, and I feel ashamed of the uninformed and naive place that these words came from. The video of this interview has since been removed. While the Jewish experience encompasses more than 5,000 years and there is so much I have yet to learn, I have had at least a minor history lesson over the past few days, and to say that it is eye-opening would be a vast understatement. Now, by the way, let me just break off here and say, these comments came in a podcast, I think at the end of June 30th. Why it's taken 2 weeks for this to come out. Now, unless I'm wrong. But I could have sworn it was June the 30th that podcast was released. And it was on YouTube now. I think that's been taken down. But I could have sworn. And it's only been brought to light now. Mind you, I didn't know about it until yesterday either. So there you go. But my goodness me. I think that's something. Why was that even, if that's true, why was that even allowed to be up for 2 weeks? Did somebody hope that that was not going to be found out? Interesting. Or maybe horrifying might be more apt a description. I want to express my gratitude to the rabbis, community leaders, and institutions who reached out to me to help enlighten me instead of chastising me. I want to assure my Jewish friends, new and old, that this is only the beginning of my education. I am committed to deeper connections, more profound learning, and strengthening the bond between our two cultures today and every day going forward. I think that this is a good start from him. I mean, it's a few tweets, but it is a start. This is him again, Nick Cannon. I just had the blessed opportunity to converse with Rabbi Abraham Cooper, Director of Global Social Action at Simon Wiesenthal. My first words to my brother was, I apologize for the hurt I caused the Jewish community. On my podcast, I used words and referenced literature I assumed to be factual to uplift my community, instead turned out to be hateful propaganda and stereotypical rhetoric that pained another community. For this, I am deeply sorry, but now together we can write a new chapter of healing. Well, those are, I think, pretty much all the tweets from Nick Cannon there over the last 12 hours plus. July the 15th, that was Wednesday, 2020. Now I can hear some of you now, oh, he didn't write those tweets, that was his PR people. Well, quite frankly, does it truly matter whether he wrote them himself or his PR people did? What if he instructed his PR people to write something? What if he worked with them and then they polished it and wrote what he had spoken to them about and dialogued with them about? Does it really make that much of a difference? And I hear some people saying, well, it goes to his sincerity. Well, wait a minute. If the guy is actually speaking to people at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and you know who Simon Wiesenthal was, don't you? You can look up who he was online. But if Nick Cannon is speaking to members of the Jewish community and those in leadership positions and speaking to, like rabbis, like others in the Jewish community, in segments of it, if he is beginning a dialogue with them, isn't that the more important thing? Isn't that the thing that you should really be looking at rather than did he write these tweets or not? I mean, we've got to a point in this country and around the world where we've become such inquisitors. Maybe another poor use of language because, you think of the Spanish Inquisition. But we get to this point where we're magnifying and examining every syllable. And some of us aren't doing the work ourselves. It's very easy to throw pot shots at people. But we have to be better, all of us. All of us, myself, you, everybody. None of us are perfect individuals, as I said before. There are things that we have all got to do better in and better on, whatever that may be in our own lives. And that's the challenge. Do you want to improve or do you want to be lazy? Do you want to be someone who's learning, who's trying to grow like DeSean Jackson is? Having said these hateful things or quoted them or retweeted them or wrote them or agreed with them and amen them. Nick Cannon and all. Do you want to be someone who says something horrible and then turns around and says, I can be better. I'm going to start doing the work. Thank you for reaching out to me. I need to grow. I'm going to work on this. Or do you want to be the person that says, I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm not even going to put on a mask over my face because that is oppressive. Just garbage. Listen to that nonsense. Are you going to be that person that says that freedom means I don't have to lift a finger to do anything? That freedom means I've got no responsibility? That freedom means that I can just sit back here and be free? That's not freedom. That's laziness. That's not freedom. That's selfishness. The notion of freedom in this country, for some people, it's just pure ignorance. Free speech, free speech. That's just nonsense. With free speech comes consequences. Just because, as I said a day or two ago, in one of these episodes I've done, just because free speech exists, does it mean that you have to always open your big mouth and say something? That's just people. My point is that people don't think sometimes before they open their mouths, before they tweet something. And it's not so much that social media is geared to this, and I get it. Social media is this instantaneous response. But just because someone tweets something, do you always have to respond to it? Heck, Lord knows, I know I've had to restrain myself from responding to some things. I've had to. And I tweet, as you know, if you've listened to me before here, if you follow me on Twitter, at the popcorn, REEL. If you've seen my tweets, yeah, I do tweet. But I don't tweet about everything. I don't respond to everything I see. There is something called restraint. There is something called reflection. There is something called stepping back. And there's a value to that. You've got these white politicians, by the way, who say racist things, and there's no evidence that they're doing any work at all. Maybe there's one exception to that, and that is the governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, who, remember, just over a year ago, remember in the beginning of the year, in 2019 when it was very clear that he had engaged in using blackface, and there was a high school yearbook of him in blackface, and he admitted it initially. Yes, it was me, and I'm sorry. And then the next day he went to, well, I don't know how this came out, and that person wasn't me. And then the guy next to the blackface, the guy next to the person in blackface was a guy in a Klan outfit. Then that on that day, the next day it was, well, I did use shoe polish as Michael Jackson. I mean, the statements got worse and worse. And then some reporter had, and this is out there, I'm not kidding about this, you can go and search it. I'm not saying, anything I'm telling you or saying to you is not something I'm making up. This is all documented, it's all available online. There's video of this. He was asked by a reporter, his wife was standing right next to him, less than 5 feet from him, 2 feet from him. Can you show us? Because he had boot polish on for this. Oh boy, for this Michael Jackson lookalike contest or something back in the day, and he had this white. He talked about the glove he had on, and I put this boot polish on. Why do you have to put boot polish on, by the way? Why can't you just have the white glove? Isn't that enough? You've got to do something racist like this? But the point I'm making is that he said to the reporter, yeah, I did this and that. And then the reporter asked him, well, did you moonwalk? Can you show us how you moonwalk? Did you do that? And he goes, as a matter of fact, I did show you. Let me. And his wife gave him a look, shaking her head at him. And then he saw her do that, and he said, my wife doesn't think it's a good idea. I've been instructed not to do that. Well, my goodness. Don't you think that it's not a good idea yourself? There's a lot of ignorance to go around. And my point is not to start to deflect here. My point is to provide context. And there are some black people, black men, particularly, who, especially in these prominent positions, who are ignorant as well and have got a lot of work to do. There's a lot of ignorance around, a lot of it. And I can start calling out names other than the ones that are pertinent to this conversation. I'm not going to do that here. And I get that there is a very clear code in aspects of the black community about airing dirty laundry. That is a very, very sensitive thing in segments of the black community. Very sensitive. And there's lots of reasons for that, historic and current and present. So I am mindful of that too. We all have to start somewhere. Nick Cannon, after what he said and agreed to, is making that start. DeSean Jackson, he of the Philadelphia Eagles, is making that start. And there are others that we probably are not aware of who are as well. And then there are some who aren't doing a damn thing. And they need to clean up their act. There are people in the black community who are prominent who have made their voices heard and said, look, talk to me. I mean, Bakari Sellers said it on CNN on Wednesday. I've spoken to Bakari Sellers on this podcast in the past. In fact, in June, you can go back to June the 1st of 2020 when he and I had a conversation closer to the time, literally just a week after George Floyd had been lynched by those 4 Minneapolis police. We had a conversation for a few minutes and talked about a number of things pertaining to Black Lives Matter and what was going on with George Floyd's killers. And we were talking about that. Bakari Sellers has made himself available to people who are in prominent positions as black people, black men in particular. By the way, Bakari Sellers has written a great book called My Vanishing Country. It's a really good book, by the way. his memoir, which is available now. I recommend you read it. So, to those black men who are in positions of prominence, or to any black man for that matter, because I do get concerned about this. We've got an election coming up. 13% of black men, I'm going to repeat this again because I talk about the 53% of white women all the time, who, and rightly so, by the way, who voted for Donald Trump. And by the way, 60 some odd percent of white men voted for him. That's not, I shouldn't not talk about that. You should talk about that. Voting for this racist, which makes it very clear to me what they also are as voters. And these black men are also misguided, brainwashed, misogynistic, and have a lot of hate in their hearts too. Self-hate to vote for someone like this, who is a sociopath and a racist and a misogynist, and hates gay people, and hates the LGBTQ community at large. He can't stand them. Especially attacks transgender people, issuing bans against transgender people by tweet. And this is a mockery. This is disgusting. And you have people voting for that. Voting for that cretin, useless in the White House. He's destroyed this country. And that's my concern. We've got 13% of black men in this country who voted for him. And you had this stunt with Kanye. You had this nonsense with people in, prominent positions like Ice Cube defending anti-Jewish hatreds, defending that. Attacking Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for speaking out on the kinds of things that Ice Cube has said. You got some black male attorneys on Twitter, prominent ones, floating this thing about, well, Joe Biden's someone who has issues. Yeah, he does. I've talked about them many times on these episodes of this podcast. I've gone through his whole record, a vast amount of his record over 45 plus years in Congress, in the Senate. Oh, yes. I've gone through his record. I've talked about all those things. And I've stressed the need to keep pushing Joe Biden. He can be pushed. He is a politician. Donald Trump can't be pushed. He really can't. He has to see the transactional benefit for him before he before he goes anywhere. Joe Biden's not like that. You can push him. It's already happened. It needs to happen more. He needs to be a bit more attuned, to say the least, to progressive issues. I think he's moving a little bit in that direction. But of course, we need to keep pushing him more. And he needs to move more. You've got black attorneys, some black male attorneys, one in particular, talking about, well, Joe Biden this and Joe Biden that. And, well, who are you voting for then? Yes, we need to push Joe Biden. And by the way, that does not end once he's elected. And we cannot take for granted he will be, because these polls are seducing people. And I remind people not to fall for that garbage from 2016. Oh, Hillary Clinton's leading by a country mile. And we see where that mile went on November the 8th and November the 9th of 2016. Same thing's happening now. Joe Biden, he's up by 12 points nationally. Or in all of these states. The election is not being held on July the 15th or 16th, 2020. It's being held on November 3rd, 2020. And what's your plan? The Republicans are stealing votes left, right, and center right now. Are the media talking about that? Instead of talking about Joe Biden up by 12 and 10 and 5 and 3, can you talk about the fact that Republicans are stealing votes right now. They know this in the media. It's not just Russia. It's mostly the Republican Party. But you see, there you go, It's all about numbers and who's up and who's down. Not who's stealing and who's not. Not who's grifting and breaking the law in high positions of power. No one's even talking about the Russia thing anymore, about Putin offering bounties on American soldiers. There was a time in the media, by the way, where that would have been a days and days and days long story. Now it gets a day at most. Half a day. We need to start being more vigilant in the community. That's my point about all of this. Forgive me for going off on a tangent, but it's all related to a point. We have to be better. We have to hold elected officials accountable. And one of the problems with what happened with Obama is that we turned around and did not demand anything of him once we elected him. And we cannot do that again. And that led to Hillary Clinton. That led to the apathy toward her, the, in some quarters, quite frankly, well understood dislike of her. And in some areas, not justified at all. For very clear reasons. And that led to who we've got in the White House now. The work must continue, is my point. We all have to work in all our ways. Look at our own lives. If there's something in your own life that you don't like about yourself, please try to change it. I look at these things all the time for myself. I'm sure there's millions of people who do. But it's difficult to get down deep and excavate. And I think that if nothing else, that's what we all have to do in some way, shape, or form. It's not easy. It takes time. It's an ongoing process. But it has to be done. If you want to make yourself a better person, and I get it, the old Gandhi quote, be the change you wish to see. Yes, of course. But this isn't about quotes. This is about words that lead to action. That's what this is about. Action. Or as Alicia Bridges once said, action. Those of you from a certain age group will know what I'm talking about with Alicia Bridges. Great song back in the day. And action. We need it. And there are people in our community who are taking it. And by the way, while there are a few black men who in prominent positions who are doing negative things, the overwhelming majority of black men and women, but in this case black men, are doing good, positive, healthy things. There's some really good leaders that we have. There are very good people in the artistic communities who are doing very important work. The Commons of the world, the John Legends of the world, etc., etc., etc. Chance the Rapper is too. Even though, I think that, these guys are going to come out and say these things to try to get black men to vote for Trump. Even some of the stuff he said lately. Oh, Kanye, where is he now? Where's Chance the Rapper now talking about Kanye running? Give me a break. There's always going to be, no one's going to have a perfect record, right? Chance the Rapper has probably been one of the really great humanitarians out here who has really given millions of dollars to public schools to improve Chicago's schooling and all kinds of things he's done that are excellent. And then occasionally he'll say something ignorant like he said recently with Kanye West and Trump. So we all have things, right, that we can do to be better. But I think this is really important to have this conversation about anti-Semitism, and particularly as these attitudes of anti-Semitism that exist in parts of the black community, just like there's attitudes of racism that exist in segments of the Jewish community too. Of course, there's segments of racism that exist, anti-blackness that exist in Asian communities. Certainly that's true in Japan. It's true in India. The caste system there. The caste system in Brazil. I mean, this is true in everywhere. It's also true, as I said, that there's this anti-Semitism in France and in these countries all over the place. Here in America, we have to be better. And we need to dwindle down this 13% number. I mean, I think black men are, quite frankly, I think black men are being targeted by the Trump campaign. That's another thing. Black men are being targeted to vote for him this year in 2020. And that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be redressed and brought downward so that we don't have this absurd number. 13% of black men voting for a guy who is racist, who hates black people, who thinks Black Lives Matter is hate. Really? That's a big problem we got to deal with as well. This seduction amongst some black men to vote for something against themselves because of self-hatred and conditioning and ignorance and a lack of education. That has to be turned around. And some of these black male entertainers, saying these stupid, ignorant things. And then you've got some black attorneys, floating this stuff about Biden. When what you should be telling your Twitter followers, sir, is that you need to push and put the heat on Joe Biden, vote for him, and then when he gets in, continue to demand things from him. It's not just about doing it now. Of course you do it now. You don't postpone that. But you do it for all the years he's in office. Just like you do it for all the years any leader is in any office. You don't just vote that person in and then go home. Voting's just the beginning of all of this. But we're not educated that way in this country, or in any country, quite frankly. Well, except in France, because they always protest in France every day. And that's a good thing. Because the citizenry is engaged. That's what that means. We're not here, though. All the stuff that's going on. We've got a governor in Georgia who has signed an executive order saying that no one in the state can enforce masks as a mandatory thing. Are you kidding? With the rates in Georgia through the roof on coronavirus? And this idiot, this guy who stole an election in Georgia, Brian Kemp, is now signing executive orders telling people you cannot order people to wear masks as a mandatory matter. You cannot order that. That's what he actually said in his executive order. We have to keep pushing elected officials, and we have to push ourselves to be better. And that's all I'm saying, even though I took an hour and a half. But it's important, like a lot of things are, but this is definitely one of them. And I have said that we are in Nazi America. Some people may find that an irresponsible thing to say, but I don't think so. When you've got someone unfurling a swastika at a rally for Bernie Sanders and giving a Heil Hitler salute in Arizona this year, and the media doesn't even talk about that, We've got lots of work to do. And I do not want to see this country go back. But we have been going back. And as a matter of fact, we've never really come forward that very much, have we now? We've made strides. But I don't know. What decade do you think we're really in? Yeah, I mean, people will say it's 2020. But where do you think we are? If you had to pick a decade along the spectrum, whether it's from the 1600s to now, where do you think we really are? What would you be able to point to a year or a decade that you think we are resembling the most right now? I'll leave it right there. I want to thank you very much for listening. Again, I'm on Twitter at the Popcorn REEL. Again, thank you very much for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.